Guys, Andrew with Prime Medical Training. We are a National American Heart Association training center, and today I'm going to go over how to use an AED. We're going to show you all the steps and things to consider as you're using and implementing this device. So the first thing that you guys need to remember is that when you're doing your compressions prior to receiving an AED, you're going to want to make sure that we're limiting the number of interruptions and compressions. And when you get the AED, this is generally the largest time suck and creates the largest amount of interruption in our compressions. And so we want to be very mindful of that. And I'll show you some little tips and tricks and ways that you can cut down on that time. When you're doing your compressions and you receive an AED, some people try to stop doing the compression, or some people try to continue doing their compressions and finish out the 30 compressions before they go to the AED, and that's actually not correct. So the way I like to tell people is, you know, compressions are great. They're super important. It helps sustain somebody's life. But an AED is what's going to restart the heart and help restart their life. Okay, so compressions are just maintenance mode until we can get something like an AED. So the AED is the priority. So as soon as you get the AED, you're going to stop compressions, you're going to grab it and turn it on first. There's a couple reasons why you want to turn it on first. One is every AED is a little different as far as how the manufacturer creates the instructions, the verbal instructions that the AED gives. And so you want to turn it on so you can hear the specific instructions for how to use this particular device. The second thing is that some AEDs, when you turn the device on, they start charging for the shock immediately from the time that you turn it on. It doesn't wait for it to analyze and then realize that, oh, okay, a shock is needed, and then starts charging. That just wastes time. So some manufacturers are very forward thinking, and as soon as you hit that on button, it starts charging. So for the sake of that efficiency and time, turn it on first and listen to the instructions. Some AEDs, the pads will already be attached to the device. Some of them, you might have to take like a little plug and plug it into the device. But again, the AED will tell you what those steps are going to be. On the pads, there's always going to be some sort of a diagram that shows where the pads should go. And what people don't realize is that, you know, there's two pads. One pad goes here in the upper right shoulder area, or chest area, and then the other pad goes kind of underneath the armpit, right underneath the left breast. Okay, so just in this general area here. The pictures, one is going to show a pad going here, one's going to show a pad going here. It doesn't matter where you place the pads. They're interchangeable. So you don't have, the diagrams are just there as kind of like an aid, but if you get it switched around, it doesn't matter as long as one's in the top right corner and one's in that bottom left corner. Okay, so you'll apply the pads. If you have any issues like hair on the chest, some AED kits will come with like a razor attached to it. You can just shave that off really quick. But I've also, in my experience, I don't always have a razor on hand, but a very common item that you're going to have in your office or at home or wherever are going to be a pair of scissors. And so even just trimming the hair down to a stubble is going to be more than sufficient to get good adherence of these pads. Okay, so that's usually the main issue that you come up with. The second thing is if it's really hairy, I'll stick the pad on the person and then I just rub my hand back and forth and it kind of works its way down to the skin and can finally get that adherence as well. So those are just a couple tricks for getting good seal. One thing that I don't recommend that you'll sometimes hear in videos is people talking about apply the pads and then take the pads and rip it off and rip the hair off the chest. That actually is not a great idea for a couple reasons. One, usually, I mean, 98% of AEDs out there only come with one set of pads. So if you use the pads to rip the hair off, Now you don't have any more pads to use. And second of all, I've seen it done where people rip it off and no hair comes off. They're not that sticky. This is not like a wax job here. So you're not going to be able to just rip hair off with these pads. It's not an effective, educated thing. I don't know who made that up. Probably somebody who's never done CPR in real life before and just thought it sounded good. So you put the pads on, one here, one kind of like right there underneath the breast and somewhat under the armpit. The main objective with AEDs is that you want, if you were to draw an imaginary line from one pad to the other, you want that line to be crossing the heart because we want that electricity. The electricity is going to flow from one pad to the other, and we want that traversing the heart so that we can hopefully stimulate it back to beating regularly again. Same with like infants and children. So with a small infant, you can't usually put pads on the front because the chest is so small, the pads may overlap, which is not a good thing to be crossing electrical wires like that. So you put one in the center of the chest and then one in the center of the back, like between the shoulder blades. And again, we're still accomplishing that imaginary line of going through the heart. So front and back, or this, upper right and lower left area. And then once the pads are applied, the AED should be able to detect that it's been applied, and it'll start analyzing. And what it's looking for is it's looking for an irregular heartbeat. So it's not going to be able to detect if there is a regular heartbeat. It's never going to say, oh, they have a regular heartbeat, everything's fine. There's only one particular type of heartbeat that an AED can detect, which is ventricular fibrillation. There are other heartbeats that cause cardiac arrest, and AEDs cannot detect those. And so there's just one, and if it detects the ventricular fibrillation, it'll advise a shock. If it can't detect that, even if the person has a normal pulse, it's just going to advise you to continue doing compressions until somebody with more advanced training and more advanced equipment can come and analyze and diagnose what's going on. So so it's either going to say no shock advised, continue compressions, or if it detects VFib, ventricular fibrillation, it's going to say shock advised, and it'll tell everybody to clear. And then it'll say press the flashing red button. You'll hit that, and immediately after pressing the red button, you can resume compressions and start in again. And the AED, a lot of times AEDs will have like a metronome so that it helps you keep the beat for your compressions. They has an internal timer, so every 2 minutes, the AED is going to tell you to stop, and it's going to reanalyze again and go through that whole process. And so you just continue doing it, shocking or not shocking, until advanced help arrives. One other thing that I'll mention, we talked about how this is the biggest time suck and how this causes the most interruptions and compressions. There's the period from the time that you turn the AED on until you shock and resume compressions. It's known as the perishock, and so that's just this time of using an AED. And during that perishock, there is an opportunity to get in a few extra compressions. So you turn the AED on, right, and you can have somebody who's still, if you got more than yourself, you can have somebody who's doing compressions while the other person is applying the pads and working around you. That's a really good best practice. But then when it tells you to clear, you're going to have to clear for the analysis. But there's always a point between like the analysis where it either determines that they need a shock or they don't need a shock, and then when you actually shock them, there's a few seconds, sometimes up to 10 seconds, where you can get back on the chest and start doing compressions. So, I'm doing compressions, it says clear for analysis, then it says shock advised, charging, and so I can go back on compressions, and while I'm waiting for it to charge, before the red button starts flashing and tells me to press it, I can get in a few more compressions, and then it'll say, all right, press the red button now. Then I have to clear again, hit it, right back on compressions. I don't have to wait for the AED to tell me to resume compressions. It's the instant that I hit that red button, I'm free to go right back in. So those are some ways that you can kind of reduce the interruptions and compressions, which is huge and a really big important piece of performing high quality CPR and ensuring better outcomes for your patients. I hope that was helpful. If you got any questions or comments, please leave them in the description or in the comments below, and we would definitely love to get back with you. Again, this is Andrew with Prime Medical Training. Thanks so much.